Good evening, Madam Chair, Commissioners. I'm Jerry Rustover, the Assistant Director of the Planning and Zoning Department. We're going to get started today. I'm going to talk to you about some of the mapping methodology, the factors that we used in coming up with the draft map. Can you put it now? Okay. So I'm going to start with going over the mapping strategy. I'm then going to hand it over to John Friganesi of Friganesi & Associates and Lorelei Juntenden of Eco Northwest and Erica Leak of our Neighborhood Housing and Community Development Department. They're going to provide a review of the housing capacity analysis, also make a presentation on what's called the housing report card and our affordable housing bonus program as proposed in CodeNEXT. So in going over, we've been asked quite often, and we have touched on this before, but apparently it bears repeating, what factors did we use in making a decision on the draft maps? So these are not necessarily listed in any particular order of importance. The first I would give is Imagine Austin, the city's comprehensive plan. In looking at Imagine Austin and how we would apply it to the draft map, we considered many of the tenets of Imagine Austin, such as promoting development in compact centers, communities, or along corridors that are connected by roads and transits that are designated to encourage walking and bicycling and reduce healthcare, housing, and transportation costs. And other items such as protect neighborhood character by directing growth to areas of change that include designated redevelopment areas, corridors, and infill sites, and recognize that different neighborhoods have different characteristics, and infill new development should be sensitive to the predominant character of these communities. So we looked at, is an area within an activity center? Is it within a node? Is it within a corridor in Imagine Austin? And not just the map that goes with Imagine Austin, but the principles contained within Imagine Austin as well. We also looked at neighborhood plans and small area plans. As you know, in 1997, the city started the neighborhood planning process. Neighborhood plans, we approach citizens who live within an area. We reach out to property owners, to business owners, and we talk to them and go through visioning exercises about what they want to see to preserve and protect and prioritize within their neighborhood character. The planning process addresses land use, zoning, transportation, parks, open space, urban design, housing, etc. These are very lengthy processes that have many stakeholder meetings. They result in a neighborhood plan that includes recommendations. These recommendations have been evaluated and considered as a part of the mapping strategy, and they have assisted our team to understand how development patterns were considered during the creation of the neighborhood plan. Most of the neighborhood plans, with a couple exceptions, produced a future land use map or a FLUM. FLUMs were also an important consideration in determining the staff recommendation for the draft maps. We also have other types of small area plans besides just neighborhood plans. So we also considered things such as the TOD, or Transit-Oriented Development District plans, corridor plans such as the one in the airport and East Riverside Drive. We have other larger small area plans such as the Downtown Austin plan. These were all considered when we were going through the mapping proposals. We also looked at the existing land uses. The uses are on the ground. These land uses do not always match the existing zoning. So where we were able to, we tried to bring non-conforming properties up into conformance through CodeNEXT. But that is, of course, at a very important starting point is what is actually on the ground today as opposed to what may be on the city map. We also looked at the community character manual, which is something that was prepared prior to the draft code coming out. This is where we ask people, what is it about your neighborhoods that you like, that you dislike? What makes up the character of the particular area that you live in? We asked people to give us visual examples. We compiled thousands of photographs over a period of several months, and the output was the community character manual, which is available online, and we did use that while going through the mapping. We also considered, as we considered existing land uses, we also considered existing zoning. That was probably the first place that we started. When we're considering a new zoning map, the first thing that we did is look at what's the existing zoning today. And we applied these other principles, but we also looked at that as the launching point. We also looked at properties. We also have some properties that are actually proposed not to be rezoned as a part of CodeNEXT. We have the areas within the TODs that I mentioned previously. We also are not going to try to change some of the areas that were in some of those small area plans, such as the East Riverside Corridor Plan and the North Burnett Gateway plan. We're also not going to attempt to change the areas within the UNO, the University Neighborhood Overlay. We're not going to change existing plan unit developments because those have gone through rather lengthy and convoluted negotiation processes. We're not going to change the NCCDs, or Neighborhood Conservation Combining Districts, or PDAs, Planned Development Areas, or areas with CURE zoning already applied to them. In addition, the staff reviewed about 3,800 conditional overlays that have been put on zoning cases that have gone through the process since the 1980s. These covered about 12,000 total parcels of land. In some instances, we were able to take the conditional overlay and determine that the conditions that were placed on it by the City Council closely to conform with one of the new proposed zoning districts in CodeNEXT. So in those cases, we went ahead and proposed changing it from the existing zoning to the new zone district. Other conditional overlays did not easily transform into a new zone. So in those instances, we are proposing to actually leave the conditional overlay in place. On the new draft 2 map, that'll show up as F25 to relate to the existing Title 25 of the existing zoning code. So it will still be necessary to go back and look to see what that existing zoning is and what the conditional overlay is. But we actually are not going to carry over the existing zoning district and name into the new map. And we have a legal reason for doing that. So even though it may be a little more complicated, it has to do with the law. In addition, we looked at areas that have interim zoning or IRR zoning, or some tracts that had no zoning at all, or UNZ is how they show up on the map as unzoned. And we also looked at areas that have split zoning. So you may have a large parcel of land that a person requested zoning on only a portion of it to get a particular project through, but the remainder of the tract kept the maybe legacy IRR zoning or DR zoning. And so we looked at those to see if it made more sense to apply a singular zoning across those tracts as opposed to maintaining that split zoning. So that is a quick summary of the factors that went into making our decision regarding the proposed staff maps. And I guess with that, I'm available for any questions.
Okay, thank you. And I'm pondering, I'm pondering whether we should just go through all of our presentations, but yeah, it's 8:05. Let's have a few minutes of questions, and I'll start with, I saw that Commissioner White had her hand up.
I just had a quick question about the F25. You said that that's going to be used in the maps for areas that are maintaining the conditional overlay?
Yes, or areas that are maintaining their existing zoning, so like the PUD.
Oh, okay. So all of the areas that are maintaining existing zoning will be F25.
For legal reasons, we feel it's necessary to change every parcel on the map, and I could get into that reason later. But so it's not going to carry that existing zoning over. It's going to say F25, but that just tells you that it's the same zoning as existed under Title 25, which is the existing code.
So then where would you go to find that?
We'll find a way on the GIS that you can click on it, and then it'll provide a link to you to the existing zoning ordinance. You can look at that.
Okay.
Kind of like we have today on the map comment tool. We'll
Right.
do something similar.
Thank you.
Okay, then I'm just going to go around here, Commissioner Shea, and then go around.
So let's see, you mentioned about the neighborhood plans, that you were looking at all the neighborhood plans. And what about the neighborhood plans that have been cited that, there's components of that do not follow Imagine Austin? And I was looking at the presentation that was at council last Wednesday, and was talking about the future small area plans, talked about some neighborhood plans that don't follow Imagine Austin yet. If those components don't, and you let it influence you a certain way because of what it exists versus what it should be to follow Imagine Austin, I mean, did you take that in consideration, or did you say, well, neighborhood plans there, even if it doesn't follow Imagine Austin, we still got to stick with it. So how did you adjust for that?
No, we did. I'd say that we considered all these things in totality. We did not say one trumps the other. So when we did see an instance where even though neighborhood plan maybe said one thing, if we felt that that conflicted with the goal, say, of Imagine Austin, that we felt was a high priority in this instance, then we went ahead and applied that zoning as opposed to what was maybe in the future land use map.
Okay. And then next question about F25. Question on that is, I think it's one of those things, so you examined it and see if it could fit a certain zoning category, but then in a lot of things that we've been hearing about, the concern is what if what was in them was something that conflicted with, say, fair housing? I mean, is that something that we would re-examine at a certain point? I mean, because we don't know. I mean, there's so many different factors that have gone into create whatever's in that CO. But if we find out that, you know what, this is an issue, can that be a factor to re-examine this? Because, I mean, I don't like the idea of leaving all these F-25s everywhere if there's a way to bring them up to.
Yeah, I don't think we looked at it from that perspective. What we looked at from the perspective of that there was at one time when the city council decided on this zoning, they decided that these particular conditions should apply. Mm-hmm. And that may have been a result of a negotiation, possibly between a neighborhood and developer, possibly between the council and developer. You know, it could be a three-way discussion, four-way discussion. We bring the staff into it. So there was concern about going in there and obliterating those conditions because a lot of times those conditions were very important at the time that the case was approved. Now, there may be instances where the property has developed and it almost to a degree becomes less relevant because the project is already maybe was built 5 years ago and there's nothing likely to happen on there in the near future. So to us, while it may have conditions to limit development, those conditions applying may not be for a very long time because the project was recently built. And so at that time, if that project goes through its useful life, somebody can come in and ask for one of the new CodeNEXT zones and over-apply it. We did not question the legality of the existing conditional overlays, presuming that the council was advised when they approved them. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner King.
So, Jerry, thank you for your presentation. I think this is very helpful. I'm wondering you mentioned about back on this on conditional overlays that we've dealt with a few of them on ZAP and on the Planning Commission as well, and they can get fairly complicated. So, did some conditions in the conditional overlays just simply go away as you transition those that didn't fit quite? Did they just go away? How do you deal with those agreed upon? Does it just wipe out that agreement?
Well, what we looked at, and I'm going to give a generic example. I'm sure you all have seen a lot of cases where, say, somebody had existing CS zoning, let's just say along South Lamar kind of situation, and they wanted to add an MU to that, or maybe a V, right? So they come in, they meet with the neighborhood goes, well, we're okay with that, hypothetically, but we really don't like all the uses that are allowed in CS. So we're okay with you adding residential, but this would be an opportunity to take out some things that I know are allowed today, but we wouldn't like to see anyway. So no auto repair, no auto washing, no used car lot, et cetera, et cetera. So we noticed a pattern in some of these cases, particularly with regard to certain districts, that they often had the same handful of uses taken out. The auto-related uses, or it could be a couple different things. And we actually had some new zones that are proposed in CodeNEXT that closely matched those conditional overlays. So if you have a district that allows residential, you know what I mean, kind of similar to CSV, but doesn't allow the auto-related uses that were prohibited in that CO, then you can go ahead and apply that new district and accomplish the same thing that the CO did. And so in those cases, we recommended going with the new zone as opposed to carrying over the CO.
Just to follow up on that, and there are some fairly complicated conditional overlays out there that don't just deal with the uses; they deal with uses and height and setbacks.
Yeah. And almost all of those have been left in.
Okay.
The code. It was only in the instances where we found, I would call them groups of commonly prohibited uses that matched a new zone that allowed for many of the things that were desired, but didn't allow for many of the things that were taken out. So anything that prohibited access and addressed site development regulations as opposed to these clumps of uses. I got to tell you, for the most part, it was the auto-related uses.
Okay.
Most
And
often.
just a clarification, when you say the F-25, it's retaining the existing zoning, the code. So does that mean that we are going to have to carry forward a big part of the old code forward for some period of time in addition to the new code?
The way I would look at it is that the existing code is going to remain as a reference, because when you have one of these zones that you're going to go and look at and say, okay, on the new map it has F25, so I click on it and it tells me, okay, this was zoned LOCO in 1999, and here's a copy of the zoning ordinance, right? And so those conditions, that zoning still applies to that property. What you need to have is you need to keep that old code around so you can go look and say, okay, what's allowed in LO? Because it might be 15 years from now, and you may have a younger person than I who doesn't remember. And so I would say it exists, but it exists in reference form as opposed to live form.
Okay, but my point really is that in terms of the staff perspective, you will really have to know two codes basically for some period of time.
We'll have to keep one around so that we can refer to
Okay.
it. We've gotten kind of used to that since the state gave us grandfathering
Thank
in
you.
the mid-'80s.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner McGraw?
Jerry, when you were talking about the neighborhood planning program, my understanding is the purpose of the neighborhood planning program is infill. That's stated in the code. And when neighborhoods were engaged to do neighborhood plans, they were expected to allow for infill and to look for the best places for infill and to use the city's infill tools, which all the neighborhoods did. Am I correct in that?
Yes, we did talk to, and obviously from 1997 to, we still have one plan underway today.
Right.
There's been a lot of changes in our city. There's been changes in priorities. There's been the adoption of the comprehensive plan, et cetera, et cetera.
I understand.
But one thing that we have told people over time is that even, obviously when we started this in 97, we were a growing city back then, we're a growing city now. And we did tell neighborhoods as we were going through this process that the growth is coming, it's here, and that we do feel an obligation as city planners to talk about that growth and to talk about each neighborhood, within each neighborhood as we went through this exercise, where would be the places, that you would like to see growth occur, knowing that some people may say not at all, but we were telling them that that is probably not realistic, so where would you like to see it within your neighborhood if you were offered that choice?
So, given that's kind of the process that neighborhoods went through, when I look at the new maps and I see a whole area, and the area that came to mind immediately was the area around Lee Elementary School, that whole area that's zoned SF3 is now on the map as R3C, and that is a big change. That is not following a neighborhood plan. That is saying somebody has decided that neighborhood plan is no longer valid, so we're going to upzone all of this housing. So I just want to know how that happens.
Well, I think that, to me, what makes a difference here, so you're talking about a FLUM that says single family, it's SF3 today, and it's proposed for R3. Is that correct?
Well, yes,
Yes,
but it
okay.
also had zoning. It was a FLUM. You're saying you're only looking at the FLUM. You don't really
No,
care what the base zoning is.
No, we look at both. As I said, we look at existing
Okay.
zoning as well as the FLUM. But the FLUM, let's say the FLUM today says single family, right? And we're proposing R3 in the second draft, and the existing zoning is SF3. SF3, as you know, allows for a duplex, right? It does not restrict a property to a single family in a single house. R3 allows for the same duplex that would be allowed today. It adds the addition of an ADU, so it allows for a total of 3 units. That's the 3 in R3. I would argue that the single-family designation on the FLUM, the R3 zoning still conforms with that. Just as today, the single-family does not mean single-family, it can allow a duplex, which is 2 units, not just 1. I think that the addition of the third unit being an ADU, not a third house, that would still be in compliance with the same spirit of the FLUM.
Well, I would argue that encourages speculation, demolition, and the removal of existing housing in order to put in more housing and make more money and displace more people. So you might disagree, but that's the way I'm seeing it.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Thompson?
I appreciate you taking us through the all the wide variety of criteria that you used when you made the map. Could you help explain the difference between draft 1 and draft 2? Because we saw the pretty significant map changes, and I'm just trying to understand which new criteria were added or which criteria were removed or reprioritized. For instance, it seemed that in the first draft there was more. I know we removed the title of the transect zones, but there was more of the idea of stepping down from the corridors into the neighborhood. And draft 2, it just sort of puts, the single family type zoning, R3C, for instance, right up next to the corridors with no step down, and then added the compatibility back.
Yeah, I would say, I can't get into specific, examples. I'm going to have to look at it a little more closely, but I would say the criteria that I laid out for you earlier were the criteria we used for both draft 1 as well as draft 2. What did we look at when making the decisions? I would say the difference between draft 1 and draft 2 is that we had a lot of public input from these two commissions, as well as the public, as well as the city council, as well as many outside groups, about what did they like and what did they not like about draft 1. And we took those into consideration and then came out with the second draft. So we heard a lot of criticism about two codes, transect, non-transect. So we went to the single spectrum of zoning, for instance. That, of course, in some areas implied, we changed, everything. So in some areas that meant that we had to take a whole new second look at what we were proposing, zoning-wise, and had to make a new decision about which zone to apply, since maybe we were getting rid of, for instance, T3. But I would say that we use the same criteria in making those decisions. The difference is the input that we heard from people, and we tried to adjust accordingly, again, using our professional judgment, but also trying to hear what people told us.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Seeger?
Good evening, Jerry.
Well,
I have a question about the F-25. What are the conditions of which the F-25 will go away? Could you explain that to me?
if somebody comes in and requests a zoning change under CodeNEXT, then you would have to ask for one of the new zones in CodeNEXT. So, for instance, if you had, again, LOCO today, that CO is a, complicated, or not one that we found meets the criteria that I spoke about with Mr. King. You would keep that LOCO zoning ordinance would still apply to the property in the future. If you came back later, what you'd not be able to do is come back later and go, I'm F25 and I want to go from LOCO to GR. Or I want to go LOCO and change the conditions of my CO. The only option in the future is going to be either keeping that you have or requesting one of the new zones under CodeNEXT.
Okay, and then I have another question, and I recognize that there are some COs or agreements, such as properties out in my area called Champions. I'm sure you're familiar with them.
Somewhat.
And will those ever go away?
The Champion Sisters? No.
No. They will, Jerry. It's the heirs. But, I mean, we've gotten rezoning, but it seems as though those tracks are still F25. At what point does that settlement agreement go away, or any settlement agreement?
The settlement agreement actually does not have an expiration date.
It doesn't.
The zoning cases were done to bring the zoning into conformance with the settlement agreement, although there's a difference of opinion about that, thus other lawsuits. But basically, I would say that's a good example. So, the I don't know what it's called now. We called it the JPI track back in the day, where the apartments are. Mm-hmm. That has a CO on it, a very lengthy CO. It's a very lengthy zoning ordinance.
Right.
And those apartments were built, and they're probably not going to go anywhere for a long time. So that is probably going to stay zoned, gosh, I can't remember what it was, MF3 or something.
MF3, I think.
CO.
4, okay.
4. And stay that way for a long time. And then it won't affect, though, density. Some people are critical of that, saying, Well, the CO by definition limits something, and therefore if you're carrying over these COs, you are, limiting what can be done in the future. And I understand that, but I also understand, like in this example, you have an apartment complex that's probably going nowhere for 30 or 40 years. And so having that zoning on there, even though you're carrying that CO over, is really not restricting anything because nothing is very likely to happen. In the future, when those apartments run through their useful life and someone wants to redevelop it in a way that cannot comply with those same conditions, maybe that they just rebuild the same number of units, whatever they had. But if they want to kind of tear it down and do something entirely different, then they will be forced to come in and ask for one of the zones that would be in part of CodeNEXT.
And the CO goes away, and
Yes.
they're no longer F-25s.
Yes, but just like today, let's say if you didn't have CodeNEXT, you could always file a zoning change to try to
Exactly.
get rid of those conditions. That's actually happened on that track, as you know.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Greenberg? Just keep on going.
So, last time we heard about the mapping criteria, we were basically told, see, these streets are curvy. So we gave them LMDR, and these blocks are straight. So we gave them T3. And now when we look, basically when was LMDR, at least in some neighborhoods, I have to admit I haven't looked at the whole city, it's R2. And where it's was T3, it's now R3. So there's still all these places where there's one thing and then across the street there's another thing. And still I feel like we don't have a criteria where we could say you're this, and this, therefore put it in. That's why you got this zoning. And I guess I still wonder, are you still looking at straight blocks and curvy streets as a criteria for mapping?
Well, the reluctance of those streets to not straighten themselves out is definitely a problem for us. What we were looking at, Commissioner, I'm sorry to be serious, what we were looking at was areas where we feel that there is a sufficiently strong connectivity to accommodate, in certain instances, somewhat an increase in density over what's there today. So if you have a cul-de-sac neighborhood, say a suburban cul-de-sac neighborhood, we don't feel that would be as conducive to maybe the addition of ADUs as a neighborhood where you have a rapid transit bus stop 2 blocks away. So we looked at things such as the connectivity of the neighborhood, the proximity to transit, multitude of those types of factors, existing land uses, existing zoning, when making those decisions. And a lot of those were old areas of the city where you had a more traditional grid pattern than you do in the kind of, we call it the lollipop cul-de-sac, a pattern of suburbia. So we do know that there are still instances, and we're still working to try to fix them. We're going to come out with one more draft of instances where you have zoning across the street or maybe across the corner that doesn't necessarily relate. And we're hoping that people bring our attention to those, because I do think that some of those areas. I mean, as we go through these criteria, I'll be honest with you, we have, I can't remember the total number of zoning tracks in the city, thousands upon thousands, and of course it was not possible to look at every one and have a half-hour debate about each one of them, right? As much as we'd love to do that, that's just not realistic. So the launching point was always, what's the existing zoning, And there's some instances where I think the existing zoning pattern doesn't make sense, you know what I mean? When you have the same situation today, and maybe because that was the launching point, that got carried over in CodeNEXT. Those areas need to be looked at more closely. I acknowledge that, you know what I mean? And so there are some of those. I saw some of those in Pemberton recently, where the zoning on one side of the street was totally different than the other, yet the street was
All the same.
all the same. So those do need tweaking, I'll admit, but we would appreciate if y'all can bring those to our attention.
So was the starting point for draft 2 maps existing zoning, or was it the draft 1 maps?
It was the draft 1 map, but it took into account, like I said, the things that we heard between February and when we issued draft 2.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Anderson?
Thanks, Jerry. I definitely feel that the map and the text are definitely going in the wrong direction in so many ways for draft 2. But one quick thing I want to mention while you're here, mentioned this briefly with Director Guernsey last week. So when unzoned gets sold, and you mentioned this a moment ago, you didn't say what it goes to. I think Director Guernsey says it goes to RR. I really hope that you guys between now and draft 3 can come up with something that makes a lot more sense. What's that? Exactly, just as though it was annexed, but it's sold. So it could be in the middle of the city, it could be Brackenridge Track, it could be Mabry, it could be all these great opportunities for housing. And in Austin, there's kind of, if that gets RR for a minute, a day, an hour, a week, whatever, and then whoever bought it, there's no way in the world they're going to build RR. We're aware of that. It doesn't make any sense for that to be RR. Whatever zoning they go for will be much more intense than RR. And of course, the narrative will be put out there, the fear-based narrative that we often hear in Austin. You know, be afraid, and they're wanting to go from this, which is 1 home per acre, to this, when of course they were never going to build 1 home per acre. So if we can come up with a way that makes a lot more sense, or F25 unzoned, or whatever it needs to be. But
It mostly has to do with Commissioner Anderson with the state law. So state law has a process for annexation, which last month took a much more difficult change for the city. But the state law, nonetheless, even before, laid out a process for annexation, and the state law lays out a process for zoning. And so the city could, of course, not apply zoning until property was annexed. And we could not do the two simultaneous to each other in most instances, because you don't want to go through all of the zoning requirements until you know that the property is actually going to be annexed. So most of the time we want to get the annexation done first and then go through the zoning process. The disconnect was oftentimes the annexation was done, and maybe if there were no immediate plans for the area, that placeholder zoning stayed for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years.
20 miles outside of downtown, maybe that's a fine idea, maybe that works. The properties we're talking about here, though, that doesn't work. So I get where you're going, I understand the reason behind it, but there's got to be a better way than that. That's all I'm saying. If you guys, we have really smart consultants, and you guys, so it seems there's got to be a better way if we can just
My
explore
hope is
it and
that
find
we
it.
still have the ability to annex. We're going to have to see how that
We'll
works
see
out.
about that, yeah. That's not us.
Okay, Commissioner Knuckles?
Thank you. And I will return that favor by saying I understand what you're saying, and I believe it's what we ought to do, because what he's talking about are tracts that are already in the city limits. They just aren't zoned. They're close to the city center, so we know it's not going to be rural residential. You know, we ought to just put an interim zoning, and your interim zoning can be anything. It doesn't have to be rural residential. Put an interim zoning on that that's more realistic about what's probably going to develop.
Yeah. Well, as I said, in the last criteria that we used, that was, the last thing I mentioned was that we did go through and look at all the existing interim RR zoning today and apply or recommend CodeNEXT zoning to it.
But what about what's going to happen with the unzoned tracts that are already in the city limits? What's the plan for that?
I would rather not comment on that right now. I would like to consult with my attorney before I answer that question.
All right. You said existing zoning was one of the mapping criteria. So if I'm remembering correctly, the zoning category most similar to the proposed zoning designation, most similar to the current SF2 is the R1.
Yes.
Okay. Did you just put R1 zoning on all the existing SF2 zoning?
On most of it, and I would say the vast majority of it, but not all of it. So there were certain instances.
But the vast majority?
I would say the vast majority, yes.
Okay.
You know, in instances where we're looking at a subdivision, that's the whole subdivision zoned SF2, you know, I don't know, out there off of 183 somewhere. You know, we looked at that, and, you know, frankly, we did, as I said, we couldn't do every lot in the city, you know, look at it separately. We said, okay, here's an SF2 subdivision. We think that that's, you know, still appropriate. Apply R1. We had the computer just, you know, kind of go through and apply those all at once. So there's places that we took a closer look at and actually debated, you know, tract by tract or block by block. And there's some areas where we were able to look at, you know, kind of a
Okay.
be consistent existing zoning and just say that translates
Okay,
to that.
last question. When you were adding density to areas that are already developed, particularly older areas where they were developed before there were really decent infrastructure standards, so really they've got infrastructure that can't handle the density that's there. If you were adding density in those areas, did you consider the effect on the existing inadequate infrastructure?
We did. I think we can always look at that closer. I think that, and then when you're doing a wholesale exercise citywide, like we are doing right now, it's hard to look sometimes at the level that some people are asking us to look at to address that issue. But we understand that obviously, changing the zoning does nothing to change the existing infrastructure. That requires money and planning and public process.
But changing the zoning could aggravate problems those areas are already suffering because of inadequate infrastructure. If the infrastructure can't handle what's on the ground today, adding density is only going to make that worse.
I understand that, but I also think that, like I said, we try to propose zoning to conform with Imagine Austin, and it may be that that this identifies areas where infrastructure improvements are needed.
But there's a provision in Imagine Austin that says all parts of this city are not going to have further development. I would think an area with inadequate infrastructure fits exactly what Imagine Austin talks about when it says that.
I understand that, but
Thanks.
I realize it's 8:30. I know there's questions. I see Commissioner Evans, so I'll let Commissioner Evans ask his question. And then I want to wrap it up, but I want to express my frustration because we've been asking for criteria of the mapping for months. And we finally have you, and we also have the consultants here who are waiting patiently. And it's like, what do we do? Our time is, we're running out of time. We've got to make our recommendation at the end of the month. And I also want everybody to be able to ask their questions. So I'll finish with Commissioner Evans on asking about the mapping. Then we'll go to the consultants. Then I will start again with Commissioner Aguirre with the questions after the consultants have finished their presentation. And then we'll figure out a possible work plan because there's way too many questions, way too many presentations, and we are running out of time. So Commissioner Evans?
Thank you. With respect to the neighborhood plans, you said they began in 1997.
Correct.
And that when they were instituted, you also created a future land use map.
Yeah, the first several did not have that, but yes.
Okay. And I realize that there have been zoning cases within those neighborhood plan areas that have continuously. But has the plan itself ever been looked at and redone?
No, one of the things, there was recently an audit of the neighborhood plans, and one of the criticisms was we haven't lived up to our own goal of updating the plans every 5 years. That has not occurred.
And so we're not doing that, yet you're giving them a pass when you're working on this code. And I just think that that's something that needs to be looked at.
I understand. I'm saying that we considered them, but yes, they have not been updated. None of them have been updated. Some are newer than others, of course, but none of them have been updated.
And they exist right in the area that we're trying to achieve our most impact.
They mostly exist in the central city, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. And on that note, then we'll have and apologies to Commissioner Aguirre and the rest of here. Why don't we go to the consultants? And I know there's a combined presentation from John Friganese and Eco Northwest. And I will let them handle it. And also, I'd like to say something else, and this is something that was brought up to me at our ZAP meeting, is that if we could have the presentations and the PDFs beforehand, that would be very helpful. And I know I brought it up at the lunch that Chair Oliver and I attended. Even more helpful would be a YouTube presentation of you walking us through it. But information beforehand would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
We're going to do a three-part presentation. The first one that I am is going to be kind of a follow-up to a number of questions that came up from the last time we talked about capacity. We, as you know, we used a 2015 buildable lands inventory. We did some assessment of what was redevelopable and came up with this buildable lands inventory. And that, of course, was then zoned based on the zoning map from draft 2. And from that, we have a capacity of housing. So we can understand, and jobs. We haven't talked about jobs, but we also looked at that. We can understand what the potential would be if someone were to build on this, both on vacant land and redeveloped land, based on what was permitted in the zoning code. So we did some adjustments since last time. We've had a lot of feedback on our model. I've never had a populations that had so many people that were interested in spreadsheets. But we have had actually a lot of people really understood them, gave us good critiques, and we've adjusted many parts of the model probably, and I think it's come out better. So we are also want to make sure that this is a capacity analysis, so we're saying this is what could happen. We've looked at the feasibility, the redevelopment model looks at the feasibility of land, and it uses the assessor's data. I know, I don't know the commissioner's name, mentioned that the assessor's wasn't particularly accurate. I did find out that the assessor's data from 2015 was updated to a market data, so there was an attempt to recalibrate it to what the actual market would be. So our assessment was done that way. Anyway, but the capacity is not a forecast. The capacity, it tells you what could fit in there. The forecast is how much will happen. And so forecast is a little bit more fortune telling or crystal ball gazing. There's some science that goes into it, but it's a sophisticated guess. Capacity is a model, but it's more basic math. You have the land, and if it develops according to the zone, how much would fit there. So we fairly sophisticated model that does it, but it's not guessing on what people will do or markets will do or something like that. So it's important to understand where Austin is right now, because I know we've had a lot of people say, well, I'd like to see real variances in vehicle miles traveled, or what would take to have Austin so that everybody would ride transit and walk. And about 88% of the city of Austin is kind of static. It's either built or it's unbuildable. You have about a third of your land is some kind of constraint or park, floodplain. 66% is built and stable as far as we can say. About 10% of your land is vacant, and that's easy to do in terms of figuring out. We just put the zone on it and develop it. About 2,500 acres is we're assuming is redevelopable. That's more of an estimate, but I think it's pretty close. Although it's only 1.6% of the property, it contains 40% of the future housing, and that 2,500 acres has about 10,000 units on it. So you get 155,000 new housing units. There's some redevelopment assumed. Almost all of those are apartments. About all but 300 are apartments. I'll talk about that later because that is obviously a concern. But buildings don't last forever unless they're really, really great historic buildings. They have a life cycle, and some of these are maybe near the end of their life cycle. Other ones may be able to be preserved and retained. At last time, we had a lot of people saying, we want you to look at some other metrics and tell us more about where these units are and the nature of the units and whether or not they're affordable. So we've done a couple of different things. We have basically a model of future Austin is populated with the households. We understand what the rents are. We can look at that. And you can put any polygon, any geography on it. So we've done it by council district. There'll be a spreadsheet on the website tomorrow or the next day that has it by council district, by type of housing, and by affordability that we have. We've done it by the AISD school district, so we have how many units and by what type are in each high school catchment area. Tonight we want to go over some other ways of telling you about how this differs from the current zoning code and somewhat from your current development parameters. Now, the current code, if you were to build out everything according to what was redevelopable and vacant, you get about 82,000 units. And if you remember, your strategic housing plan target is 135,000. So that's a little bit different. The CodeNEXT 1 draft is about 133,000 housing units. And the current draft, our best estimate right now, is about 155,000 housing units. So between the current code and CodeNEXT Draft 2 is about double the number of housing units available in the city of Austin. The other question is, where is this housing capacity? Is it all on the east side? Is it all on the west side? Is it all downtown? So we produced this heat map that shows kind of a concentration. It's a graphic that shows where the housing is concentrated. And we had a number of requests to compare it to opportunity areas. So you had this study done in 2013 by a very credible group of people, very credible consultants. And they basically looked at where are areas in Austin and ranked them by how good the schools were, the access to jobs, access to upward mobility, to housing and environmental issues. So that's the map that they have, and the bright red, probably not the best cartographic technique, but it wasn't my map. The bright red is the highest opportunity areas. The kind of light color is the lowest opportunity areas. And so we mashed these two maps together and counted out how much happened there. And this is the result we got, and I believe you all have a copy of that report card. Basically, you can see under the current code, you get about 30,000 units. Under CodeNEXT, about 79,000, almost 80,000 units in the very high, and moderate areas. And you can see underneath that a big difference between in the very high, how many units you get, and the so forth. So there's a big increase in housing in CodeNEXT with areas that have either very high, or moderate opportunity. And then down below that, you can see how many are affordable at 100% MFI. Now, 100% MFI in Austin is pretty high because your median family income for a family of four is $80,000. But these are units that the market could build and rent for something that was affordable at 100% MFI, which I think is about $1,700 a month. So that's not cheap, but it is affordable. And we calculated how many of the units could be built. And I have to say, I'm not guaranteeing they will be built because developers can charge what the market will bear. But under the current land costs and rents and the cost of construction, they could build it and rent it for that and still make a 12% profit. If you look at that, so these are the more affordable units, regardless. There's very few under the current code. Your current code has a number of things that make building expensive and encourage larger units. You can see that you get about 53,000 more affordable units in areas of opportunity under CodeNEXT. So CodeNEXT has got a very substantial difference in terms of putting housing in areas where it's currently not permitted, especially types of housing that can be more affordable in areas of Austin that are now not open to that type of housing. The other one was we looked at the urban core, and since drawing what we were told the urban core, we found out that if you talk to 5 different people in Austin, they have 5 different. So we'll do some more urban core measurements, but this is the one bounded by major streets, what was in and out. And again, you can see the proportions aren't that different in terms of what's in and out. The numbers are quite different. And the amount of affordable units within and without the urban core is quite a bit bigger. And it's actually looks about 50-50, frankly, in terms of what's in and what's out. Why did this happen? Why is there such a difference between CodeNEXT and your current code? You can see here the current code produces housing primarily at 120% MFI and up. Basically, it's very difficult to build anything under the current code less than about $1,800 a month rent and on up. The CodeNEXT allows the possibility for building products down to about $1,400 a month, which gets you down to 70 to 80% median family income. Again, not that people will have to do that. They could do it, and it will depend somewhat, but it does open the door to more affordable housing types. And you'll see the yellow being the current code, the other two, the blue being CodeNEXT. There's quite a bit of difference in more modest housing types. Why is that? Primarily, it's the capacity comes from multifamily zones close to Imagine Austin centers and corridors. Remember last time about 90% of your new units under CodeNEXT were within a quarter mile of a transit line. And that shows that a lot of this stuff is pretty well connected. So it's mixed-use block form development, row house and townhouse, and housing and multi-unit development, including the smaller plexes, the stuff that is not the 200-unit one, the 8-plex, and so forth. Also, the missing middle, under the current code, missing middle housing, which is the row house, townhouse, duplex, cottage home, 27% of the total, only 6,300. That goes up to 35,000 potential units under the new code, about 21%. So there's a big change in opportunity. And frankly, that's what zoning codes do. They provide the rules and the opportunity for things to happen. They don't make them happen. They're permissive. They're not leadership in that regards. When it comes to the affordable housing bonus, and Lorelei and Erica will talk about this quite a bit more right immediately following this. Currently, you've got about 1,450 units that are estimated with the current code that you would get in terms of uptake. Under CodeNEXT, for a number of reasons, you're going to get up to 5,000 in terms of capacity. And frankly, if you ask the question, could we get more? With density bonus, a little more. If you added to density bonus a number of other programs that have been talked about, you can get a lot more. Do you want to see how? I wish you would ask, and maybe we could do that. Scenarios are about exploring things, and if you're interested in more affordable housing, that's an option that we could follow. So it's just, we need to look at the other things. Erica and Lorelei will talk about that. We are concerned about the 10,000 units that are being redeveloped, or that potentially could be redeveloped under CodeNEXT. There's 7,500 under the current code, so a lot of these are threatened under either one. Our model is showing vulnerability to being redeveloped. These are older units, and it's the landlords own these things, and at some point the roof goes out, the units aren't energy efficient, the plumbing's bad, and the air conditioning needs replacement. At some point they say, I'd rather just tear it down and build a new one. On the other hand, some of these things can be maintained. It's not always profits. So we'd like to go, we know where they are and we know where they're concentrated, and we will go and look at the details of that and examine between now and the next time if there's something that we can do to identify more vulnerable units that are viable over the next 10 or 20 years and see if there's anything we can do. We've done a small sample, and currently the CodeNEXT 2 has not upped the development density, so they're pretty much sitting there with some vulnerability under the current code. So I think there might be a couple thousand units that we can identify through that. That's the end of the housing report card, and I think it begs a question about housing affordability. I know that's of interest to a lot of you, and so Erica and Lorelei will talk about the housing affordability component of CodeNEXT, how CodeNEXT fits in with the affordable housing programs.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Erica Leek. I'm with the city's Housing Department. So I'm just going to start with a very quick primer of both the city's existing density bonus program as well as the proposed affordable housing bonus program that's included in CodeNEXT. So just wanted to start out with a graphic that's put together by Housing Works Austin that looks at various household incomes for people, in different professions, and basically looks at, if you're a home health care worker, you would need housing at some affordability level. And so when we think about what are our housing needs in the community, it's helpful to think about them in terms of people needing housing at different prices. So this image is actually from the city's adopted strategic housing blueprint, and it's another way of articulating how much housing is needed at different income levels. And then the other element of that is looking at what are the key strategies for creating those units at the different price points. So for very low income families, those are households where we usually need to subsidize the units. So we use federal funding and local funding to subsidize those units. When we get into higher median family incomes in the 60 to 80%, that's where density bonuses can be fairly effective at helping to create income restricted units, but they are basically created through incentives in the zoning codes. And then when you get into higher incomes, then those are often, provided fairly well by the market. So we're focusing today on density bonus programs, and right now, and I'll get into how those are structured within CodeNEXT. So you all have probably heard about density bonus programs that we have in the city. Right now, Austin has 10 different density bonus programs, and they all have unique requirements, unique community benefits. Some of them have been relatively effective. Some of them have not been very effective for a variety of reasons. And there's just a partial list of those programs on this slide. And this graphic is not intended to be anything that you can read, but it shows, this is a spreadsheet of basically the ordinances that go along with all the city's existing density bonus programs. There are a lot of them. We know that, and one of the goals of the proposed citywide affordable housing bonus program is to bring more consistency to density bonus programs overall. So the citywide proposed program would have a proposed MFI level at 60% of the median family income for rental, 80% for ownership. There's certainly the desire to have the units on site, but there are other options, either off-site units, but in proximity of the development, or potentially an in-lieu fee. And then there is also the option for an in-lieu fee for commercial developments. A few other things to note is that the density bonus or affordable housing bonus is really baked into each code, each zoning type within the code. And so that's a difference from our existing programs. They also are more cohesive, and they are specifically calibrated to the various requirements that go along with each zoning type. We did want to be clear that right now the proposal is to incorporate the vertical mixed use density bonus program and smart housing into the new code. The downtown density bonus program and the university neighborhood overlay are brought into the new code, but they're not incorporated into the citywide program. And then there are a number of other density bonus programs that are not planned to be brought into the citywide program right now, but they could be in the future if there is capacity to do that work. In terms of areas, one of the major benefits of the new program is that it will cover a much larger area than the existing program. So this shows the locations of the existing programs, and they cover approximately 6,200 acres, and the proposed bonus areas add an additional approximately 18,500 acres. And then those are divided into some zones have height bonuses, some have unit bonuses, some have bulk bonuses. But when you look at all of the existing density bonus programs plus the additional areas that will have the citywide program, that comes up to a total of approximately 23,500 acres. So it's a much broader area. And as John mentioned, one possible thing to look at is, should there be density bonus options in more of the zones? And so I think that's an item for consideration. A couple of other improvements from the existing land development code in draft 1 is that it is clearer about what is required. There are better design standards and also an incentive for multiple bedroom units, which is something that we heard from the community. In terms of the question of how many market rate units would have to be allowed to be able to basically fund the affordable units, if you're looking in the area in red at 60% of the median family income, you would have to build 4 additional market rate units to be able to basically cover the cost of one affordable unit. But if we were trying to get the affordability down to 30% of the median family income, you would have to build 6 market rate units to be able to cross-subsidize one affordable unit at 30% of the median family income. So basically, the lower the median family income that you want to try and serve, the greater number of market rate units that are required to be able to make that work. And then this is basically just a representation of where the different types of bonuses are allowed in the different zoning categories. And so this matches the maps where we saw, that bulk is allowed in some places, height is allowed in some zones, and additional units are allowed in some zones. So this is just sort of a different way to show that. And as I've mentioned, we have heard feedback that some people would like to see bonuses in more zones. So I think that's an item for further consideration. And just a reminder, going back to the blueprint, we talk about density bonuses as being one of the many tools that will be necessary to help achieve the city's affordable housing goals. And so density bonuses show up in our chart as both an existing tool that we want to continue and as a tool we want to make sure to improve upon to be able to leverage more units from that. And over to Lorelei.
Thank you. So, hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here tonight. I have not had the chance to talk in front of you yet, so I'll do just a quick 10-second introduction. My name is Lorelei Juntanen. I'm a partner at Echo Northwest, which is the economics consulting firm that has been assisting with calibrating the affordable housing bonus program and doing some of the economic analysis behind the scenes related specifically to housing affordability. John gave away the punchline to my presentation, which is that the draft 2 CodeNEXT zone adds the capacity for 5,000 income restricted units through the additional acreage that's inside of the bonus program. But I'm going to take a few minutes to put a little finer point on that and talk a little bit about where and how those units are distributed. I borrowed John's slide here to make the point that we too are looking at this from a capacity perspective, trying to understand how much additional space is allowed for potential affordable housing bonus units through the changes in draft 2. We are not forecasting what a developer may or may not choose to build. We also are focusing very much on the public policy component of it. Any developer will tell you that a magical series of stars have to align in order for development to happen. They have to control the land, they have to have access to capital, the development has to be feasible. The lever that we are talking about tonight is the public policy lever controlled through zoning and the requirements and incentives that are built into specifically the affordable housing bonus program. So that is the focus. It is important to consider the fact that a city does have access to some of these other levers as well. If they own land or can provide write-downs, they can do a lot more to try to incent or create affordable housing. And you've heard Erica talk a little bit about that, but for right now, we're going to focus just on zoning. Okay, so John talked a little bit about this report, which I believe is in your packets or available online through a link. And this is the report that the Kirwan Institute put together that talks about the geography of opportunity in Austin and specifically measures access to education, to high-income jobs, to high-quality outdoor space, the kinds of things that are good about living in Austin. And the deep red is good, so the darker the red color, the better. And the map that I pulled forward here has little blue triangles that show where all of the existing affordable and subsidized units are in Austin. And it should be painfully obvious from looking at this map that currently affordable and subsidized units are concentrated in areas that have low or very low access to opportunity. So we wanted to bring forward this concept of what is Draft 2 doing to help to redistribute that access to opportunity. The bar on the left-hand side shows what happens with your existing acreage that are within the density bonus programs. There are about 5,000 acres. First of all, the Draft 2 CodeNEXT basically goes times 5 up to 25,000 acres and really does a much better job of distributing those acres in areas that have access to moderate, high, or very high opportunity. Looking at it from a unit perspective, the existing subsidized units, so again, those are those blue triangles that were on the previous map that we looked at, just 1% of those units are in areas that have very high access to opportunity. The existing bonus program, which has about 1,200 units in it, has done a better job of distributing those. But the Draft 2 CodeNEXT zones, because they've increased the capacity for additional bonus units, does a much better job of distributing those in areas that have greater access to opportunity. And just one more way to look at this is to think about it in terms of the concentration of the affordable units. So you've got on the left side with your existing bonus incented units, a large portion of those units are concentrated in census tracts where there are other units. Whereas under the Draft 2 code, the units are much more broadly distributed across the city and are not as concentrated in those same census tracts. Again, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the bonus program, any bonus program in any city, is always going to be just one arrow in the quiver, that there are many other tools that really need to be brought to bear to solve an affordable housing problem. And there you see it right there in the middle of your development-derived column. There are a number of tools that are just not available to you here in Texas, including rent control and impact fees and a number of other tools. But the housing blueprint, which Erica has talked about, provides a really great framework for action to pile on some of these other types of tools and really try to work comprehensively toward a solution for housing affordability. I want to take just a really, I'm going to go through this quickly because I know it's getting late and nobody likes to deal with development economics at 9 o'clock at night. But just to give a couple of slides about how those tools can interact with each other to even move the needle further. So using an example of the building that you see on the slide here, on the one side, the base building that's allowed through the zone, and on the other side, how many units you could have if you accessed the bonus. So if we apply just the bonus program, a developer may be able to build up to 4 income restricted units in that building. Okay. Now, if you layer on a TIF subsidy or a land write down or some other capital contribution that equals 10% of the project costs, now she would be able to build up to 12 income restricted units. And then if you layer on an additional tax abatement that equals 100% of the taxes, you can get up to 18 units. Alternatively, you could get fewer units at a deeper level of affordability. The point here being that an affordable housing bonus program, like is proposed through Draft 2 of CodeNEXT, really does open up the door for a conversation with a developer about other kinds of tools that could be layered in together and can be the starting place and foundation for a really comprehensive approach to addressing housing affordability. It is not a silver bullet, but together with all of the other tools, it can do quite a lot to help to move the needle. So we are continuing, and Erica alluded to this as well, we are continuing to work on calibrating the bonus program. We have heard feedback about considering moving bonus options into lower intensity zones and into smaller building types, so we're looking at that possibility. We are continuing to evaluate the potential effectiveness and yield, including the potential for changing where the zones are that have bonus programs in them. And we are thinking as well about calibrating the in lieu fee and how that interacts with the choices that a developer might make. And all of this is information that we'd be very happy to have your feedback on tonight, so that as we go back and continue to work on the bonus program, Draft 3 can look even better and better match your expectations. That's it for our presentation.
Okay, thank you. It's an evening of presentations, and I will start with Commissioner Aguirre because I had left with her. I don't want to put you on the spot. If you don't have a question, you don't have to. But I
guess I just need to say this. I'm seeing more of a theme because I actually live in East Austin, like east of 35, and I'm seeing a reference to opportunity areas being primarily west of 35. And it seems like East Austin gets stuck with the opportunity of gentrification or, displacement. So that is problematic. It seems like I don't know how CodeNEXT or maybe us doing a paradigm shift and looking at all of Boston being an opportunity area. And I think we need to look at that. I'm starting to get a little bit upset about being referred to as a non-opportunity area in East Austin, so I'm being a little bit defensive. But that's something to think about. I don't want us to go through that theme of moving people into opportunity areas, because I think all of Boston should be an opportunity area.
I think that map would make me mad if I was, because East Austin's a great place. People are proud there. It's a wonderful place to live. I think that because of historic development patterns, a lot of the nice things went on the west side, and that's what it's saying. That was done by Policy Link. It's Angela Glover. She's that group, they spend their life trying to make cities better and to address inequity. So the people who did that were not trying to diss East Austin at all. They're trying to point out that if there's subsidized housing should be all over Austin. And we're using it as a way to measure whether or not we're putting it in all places. So there's plenty of good affordable housing in CodeNEXT in East Austin. The thing that's new is there's a bunch of affordable housing in West Austin too. So it's kind of leveling the field. And I think, on the other hand, that it makes a lot of sense to try to bring some of the things that gave them high scores to East Austin, too. You're totally right on that.
Commissioner De Hoya?
Nerius Hart, and I'll try and limit myself to 3 questions. I know a lot of commissioners have other comments and questions to make. So, point of clarification, I had a citizen approach me and say that the TCAD figures that we're using based for property value assessment are based on 2014 numbers. Is that accurate?
Yes. And the reason is it took a lot of the TCAD data, when you get it, is dirty. There's a lot of empty fields. There's a lot of things that aren't filled out. For the purposes of our analysis, we had to have that cleaned up. And that was a long process by the City of Austin GIS.
Sure.
And we have an inflation. We use actually not the assessed value, but an inflated value called market value, where we inflated it. And if we needed to, we could recalibrate that. But to get a whole new data set from them would require a bunch of new work.
I think it would be negligent of us not to base it on the most recent TCAD work we have. And I work in tech and master data management. I understand the data cleansing that you're talking about that needs to occur. But we're sparing at the, I don't know, I'm losing my analogies here, but we're looking down the barrel of a shotgun of when we have to get to this CodeNEXT. And if we have to have spent many millions of dollars to get to a point based on not even the best possible data that we have as a starting point, I find inexcusable. And I'm not placing that on y'all, but if this is the forum for feedback, then let's go ahead and make that update and use the most recent data that we have access to. Opportunity area data. So the heat map seems to indicate something that's contraindicated by your report card. So you talk about basically 50% of the high opportunity or of the housing capacity and opportunity areas. I think it would be really helpful for us, especially as we move from commission into a council type feedback and public negotiation phase. I think we need to have that broken up by council district. So if we can have all of this data that you have here broken up by housing, by city council district, I think that'll be very helpful for public input moving forward. And the last thing that I want to address is that I heard a lot of lukewarm affordability talk. So we might implement this great suite of tools that we have. We're considering the possibility of greater distribution of, low MFI housing in the high opportunity areas. And I'm not going to even touch the previous comments much. But I think we need to see that more concretely. And when you allude to historical development patterns, I think we had roughly, 11 speakers? And every single one of those speakers was here to address the fact that we got stuck somewhere along the way by influential community members creating a narrative of neighborhood character being the architectural form. And I think this evening's public speakers show that the historical development patterns that you're referring to are blatant racial segregation from 1928 on, and the redlining that occurred in Austin to create the current development patterns, historical and current, that we face today. So I think I'd like to see that addressed more directly, and then make sure that we're not taking a lukewarm approach. And just for clarification again, is this the forum where you're coming to solicit feedback on how aggressive you are in your pursuit of those affordability tools?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a possibility that we could look at a scenario where it's applied more aggressively, and we'd welcome that. But the problem is the levers that we would use to do that are not zoning levers. We will be using some zoning levers, which is density bonus. But to get beyond a few more thousand units, we have to apply, as Lorelei suggested, some type of incentive that takes a developer and makes it possible for them to add more affordable units.
So
with that,
3.
I would think the council would have to do it, but I'm sure they'd be interested in what you think. If you want to see what a double, triple, quadruple the number of affordable units would be, we would just do a scenario and tell you what effect each of those tools had, or some of the tools, not all of them. And so they could consider doing that. I mean, I think I can speak for all of us, we're not lukewarm about affordable housing, but we are in a zoning code development process, and that's a limited toolkit. It works really well with other things, but it's only part of the toolkit that you would use. So it's only a hammer, and we need a saw and a screwdriver and a whole bunch of other tools, if I need that analogy, to make the vehicle that you want.
Absolutely. So I think we need to provide direction as a body to see those scenarios mapped. What is every single tool that we have access to within state law to get the affordability that we need as a community to address the public comments that came before us tonight, that come before us every night, that we see in the cases, that in our caseload when we're not meeting and discussing CodeNEXT. So to address racial equality, socioeconomic segregation, we need to see the most aggressive modeling possible. That may not be where we land, but we need to see what that scenario looks like to have an informed conversation. So I really look forward to seeing that.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Schisler?
You only had that map up for a couple minutes of where you said the growth was going to be, and I was wondering how many real estate professionals you have reviewed that and looked at it, because just my 2-second glance, you had a big spot over in the Circle C area off Mopac and 45, and you know, if you've been in this town for more than 5 years, you know there's a settlement agreement that was reached 30 years ago with the city that there's only a certain amount of development that's allowed, and that area is maxed out as far as I know, and there's no way you can put any multifamily in that area. So I'm wondering if it was vetted through any real estate professionals.
That buildable lands map has been vetted through the city of Austin and
The city staff, but I mean real people that really do it.
And the zoning.
I mean real people that do it every day. When's the last time you bought a piece of property? I mean, I deal with city staff for 20 years, so I know their perspective on things, but there's still, you need to have a handful of at least professionals that do this for a living that can do it.
In front of several professionals, and they've given us very good
feedback.
We took out the Robinson Ranch because of their feedback on infrastructure, and I'm sure that'll continue to be improved as this is reviewed by more. So we're not afraid of review. We put the information out there, and we welcome critique, and it'll just make the model better. So we'll look into that.
All right, thank you.
It's worth noting that at least in part, the location of that development is related to where the zones go,
right,
because that's what creates the capacity. So the question that you're asking is as much about the zoning map, as it is about the capacity analysis. Those two things are linked.
Right, you can zone things, but if it can zone things, right? But if the city has a book 4 books this thick, telling you why you can't build on it, then zoning it, if you've got critical zones and other 10%, 15% impervious cover, you can zone it for high rises, but you'll never get them. Thanks.
We'll take a look at it, though. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
Thanks.
Commissioner Breithaupt?
I'm interested, just a lot of our folks were talking about building in the urban core, making sure that we have the density, and you flashed a map real quickly about what you were considering the urban core, and because that's a big part of this report card, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what boundaries y'all drew for that. So
I wish somebody from Austin would tell them about the boundaries. It was, I know Mopac on one side, and but I think someone more familiar with Austin, that was given to us, and we kind of did that. But it's basically a ring of roads that people thought was the urban core, and I understand that there's parcels just outside that a little bit on the north, a little bit on the south, that include that. And yeah, we'll be glad to put that up.
But we do know that there are kind of different definitions of the urban core, and I mean.
But you got your definition from city staff, or where did you get? Where did you get your definition? You said somebody provided it to you?
Yes, it was provided to us by the city, and it was provided by one staff person to my staff person, and I personally don't know who did it.
Yeah, that's.
I think it's set up with the 20, if you're basing it on where the city gives you a 20% reduction on your parking is what has always been
Okay.
considered the core, and that's pretty much defines it
So
right
we've heard
there.
that there's a little spot to the south, east that should be added, and a little bit more on the north. And I think it's easy to draw another one and take a look at that and see if it changes it. Probably not going to change. I mean, it's kind of like, what's the proportion? It's not going to change it a large amount. But we'd be glad to do that too, and intend to do that.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Kazi?
So I'll start with a question for John. John, you had said that there was some concern about the depending on multifamily as much, and you said you were going to expand on that some more. Could you expand on?
I don't remember. I said that this time?
I believe you were saying the concern was that a lot of the additional units that were part of the 160,000 were mostly multifamily, and that it was.
That was a reason that you got more affordability or more economical units. Is that the new multifamily units that are permitted by right in the code are at a higher density and can be more economically developed, even though they pay more for land because of the density and the height and so forth. So you're getting, in a sense, building each unit, the per unit cost is less in those than in lower density and more dispersed types. So I'm not worried about that. It is, compared to your current mix, there's more multifamily than you current have. You're about 50%. I think our mix is about 60. And it has a lot more missing middle, which is more of the, you don't get as much single-family detached housing because you just don't have the land base for that. It's backfilled with some missing middle, duplex, townhouse, row house, cottage home for that. But yeah, it's about 60% multifamily in the mix of new capacity.
Okay. So I would just reiterate Commissioner Schischler's comment about vetting some of the numbers, because I've heard in the community that South Shore is mostly developed, and there's, that number might be off by 90%. I think your model shows 4,000. I know you've been very receptive to comments from.
Right.
But I would just say, continue to vet those numbers, because if they're off by 90%, I mean that's serious.
Yeah, it would be.
Also, as far as relying so much on multifamily, I would say, have you looked at historically how many multifamily permits or units have been placed on the ground every year, and if we're off by a factor in our projections?
I haven't recently. I know in Texas recently, multifamily has made up the bulk of units in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. So for the recent past, at least, I haven't. But we can easily find that and look.
Yeah, I'd like to see if it's off by a factor. I mean,
Right.
as long as we're in the ballpark of what we've seen in the past, the peak
Right.
of development. And then the question I had for Lorelei was about density bonuses. You said it was a capacity and not a forecast.
Right.
And that we can't really tell what developers may take advantage of the incentives or not. But have you considered looking at historically the bonuses that didn't work and why they didn't work, or why do we think that this one has a better chance of working?
Well, I mean, that might be as much a question for you as it is for me, having been the person who administered so many of the previous programs. But yeah, that has actually been taken into consideration, and part of the reason for the transition to the bonus program is simplifying and unifying. And some of the previous density bonus programs worked well, and some of them didn't. And we tried to take that into consideration when putting this one together. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
The housing department has definitely done some analysis on which density bonus programs have and haven't been very effective, and some potential reasons for that. And we have a report on our website that goes into those if you're interested.
Sure. My question is more about, does the historical analysis allow us to forecast, at least to some degree, what we might see?
I mean, it's a little hard to say because the program would be changing. I mean, we know it would cover a greater area. We expected that if the current programs stayed in place, that would produce about 1,500 units over the next 10 years, density bonus affordable units, and they think it could produce 5,000 because of the greater area.
Maybe one way to help a little bit with that question is to explain how we got to that 5,000 number. So what we didn't just make that number up. What we did is we compared the development feasibility for the base building to the development feasibility for the bonus use building. And if the bonus building won, we shipped that off to John and he ran it through the capacity numbers in Envision. So that's built into it to a certain extent. The development feasibility has been considered. We are still looking at it from a capacity perspective because we need to understand where that zone is allowed. But we're not coming up with those numbers out of thin air. We're only applying them if the bonus building is more financially attractive to a developer than the base building. And one thing I know about incentives is that if they are not better than status quo for a developer, they're not very likely to be taken up. So yes, we're very much considering that.
Sure. Yeah, that's helpful. And then I have a question for Jerry. Should I wait for later or just stop?
Just go for it.
Okay.
Except he's not.
Yeah.
Oh, there he
moved.
Why don't you sit over here, Jerry?
Jerry, so you said for the mapping, the same criteria was applied for draft 1 and 2, with the exception of you heard the comments between draft 1 and 2. So my concern is that you could have now the pendulum of compatibility of any or whatever pendulum swinging the other direction and have a series of comments with the same criteria now leading you a direction maybe back closer to draft 1. Does that make sense? I mean,
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that we obviously are aware of what we did with draft 1 and what we did with draft 2, so we would be looking out for that. And I have to emphasize that, yes, we received, I had a slide that I went over yesterday. We had 4,100 comments, I think, online, 16 neighborhood meetings, 100 separate office hour segments. But we didn't just take a comment people gave us and said, okay, we're going to change that.
Sure.
You know what I mean? We used our professional judgment in that. So we obviously don't want to get stuck in a pendulum kind of situation. We thought that people offered some constructive criticism, and we took that into account. Some things went, both ways, if you want to look at it that way. Some things got denser sometimes, some things got less dense. But we're not going to kind of get in a game of where we're just taking what the last person told us and running with it. We need to be careful consideration of everything.
And Chair Oliver.
Yay. I want to thank you guys for putting together a report card. I think this is a great starting point for comparative tools. And I know there's been a lot of requests for different ways to find some kind of context and measuring ability between the new code, old code, or draft 1, draft 2, current code, and then other scenarios that people want to see. And some things I was kind of picking up on and putting together numbers that seemed relevant to me was 20% missing middle, but don't know where the missing middle went. Was that urban? Was that suburban? 1/3 of the units being at this, well, I'll say relative affordability at 100% MFI or less. The thing that kind of jumped out at me was when I looked at kind of this idea of focusing on the affordable or relatively affordable in high opportunity or very high opportunity areas, totaling up to 14 to 15% of the capacity that had been added. And that's where I think some people start to get worried about what are we delivering overall in the capacity numbers. One question would be, how does that opportunity map and that 14-15% number within this, how does that compare against the growth concept map of nodes and corridors? And is there an alignment at putting people closer to transit and activity centers and mix of uses? Has that been looked at? Because it seemed that might be a separate analysis.
We looked at just unit count close to transit, in last time, and it was 140,000, so it was a lot.
Okay.
I would like to parse it by different areas of the city, and frankly, we can test VMT if we get down to a smaller area. We can do that quickly. We run the whole city. It takes 3-4 days, and sometimes have to be run twice. If we do a small area, we can run it in an afternoon.
Sure. And I think
I struggle with which geography to use. So we use council districts, and we do have relatively affordable by council district and by high school catchment area. And maybe we should do it by a neighborhood boundary.
Yeah, I would echo Commissioner Hart's comments earlier about there's going to be such an importance on looking at this by district in some form or fashion.
By council district?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's that, and I think you even mentioned like the tool. There isn't really zoning tools maybe to take this to twice that number. You've got to start looking at incentives and other things. So I think we need to start talking out loud and get beyond the possibility of incentives. If we want to say, what does it look like to hit 30% of very high and high opportunity affordable housing capacity, so that we know what that is, and then that might get us away from saying, show me a whole new map of the city. It's show me what that looks like in this swath of land, in these different type of maybe potential varying district conditions, so people can understand, well, in order to get that, these are the bells and whistles that would come with that kind of scenario. Otherwise, you're going to keep hearing, show me a new map.
That's a really good point. I think if you're a musician, this is like the strings are on the guitar, now we have to try and tune it, and putting on a new set of strings doesn't help you get a tune. In a sense, if you can adjust the map you have, I think you'll get farther than asking for a whole new map. And I think that if we can add new tools to the affordability, other than just the density bonuses and zoning stuff, I think we could get farther. So I welcome that.
When can you give that to us? Yesterday, day before?
Sure.
Okay.
Well,
we do need
seriously, I know
before
you need
next
it
meeting.
within a couple of weeks.
Okay, before next meeting.
We'll have to.
It is important, though, to remember that those other tools don't live in CodeNEXT.
That's right.
Those are outside of the purview of anything related to CodeNEXT. So we
it'll
can
be a
help to
hypothetical.
provide some discussion about what that might look like. But there are a whole series of additional policy conversations that will have to happen before any of those tools could possibly be implemented. Just take a tax abatement, for example. You're not going to put a tax abatement everywhere in the city. That would destroy your general fund. Where does it make sense to do that? For us to come forward and model that would have to hypothesize quite a lot in order to be able to provide that kind of input. So I just want to caution you that we can come back and have that conversation, but all of that happens outside of CodeNEXT and would require many subsequent discussions before implementation could occur.
And I would quickly add that, I mean, when you're looking at that, you're really talking about dollars, in various forms. You're talking about, if you're talking about a tax increment financing district, it basically means you're taking tax dollars that perhaps accrue from additional development and putting them into some particular benefit, but it means that they're not going into the general fund. So when you were talking about the various incentives, it's basically saying that you prioritize a specific thing, in this case affordable housing, but it's moving the dollars from someplace into affordable housing. So it really does take a shift of where the money goes.
Sure. And I'll pretend as if Commissioner Vela is here and maybe continue his line of questioning on the scenarios, and that is, I think 30-something thousand of the units in the housing capacity are in the outlying PUDs. And some people would look at that as a criticism, saying, well, we're relying upon sprawl to make up a chunk of this number. And what if we just discounted the PUDs as a crash test scenario and said, let's ignore the PUDs and the capacity that they will bring. They're going to bring traffic with them and other issues. What if we tried to make up that 30,000 in another way? And it was, show us the tools in which that could be used as a scenario. And then I know Commissioner McGraw has also asked for, show us the translation map of current zoning to new zoning. So SF3 becomes all, say, R2. Show us what happens if everything is R2 that is SF3 today. And that way we can see the numbers. and we have the comparisons, and we're all going to come to our own conclusions anyways, and we're just going to keep asking you. So I think if we can run those sort of scenarios, you're gonna help us get to confidence in the answers we may or may not firmly believe in, or we might be guessing at. So I don't know if that's also within the 2 weeks, but
Probably not, but I think what we can offer within a couple of weeks, and I'll have to consult with Lorelei.
Well, and staff will have to provide
and
some input on that.
See
also.
where it is, but we'll take that into account and see what we can do.
Okay. And
the whole new map is a big.
Yes. Well, and that's why I'm trying to get away from asking for a new map. It's like you crunch numbers,
right?
And tell us what that number represented by what lever did you move to give us a new set of numbers. And then I need one last clarification. This in capacity versus forecast. There are no guarantees that capacity that's representative of units at 100% MFI or less stays there. As rising home costs, land costs, those can slip off the map. The capacity can dwindle, not increase.
At that price point, yes.
Yeah. So at the rate of, has there been any projections at how much capacity we lose each year based on rising home values? That's a big deal.
Okay, thank you. And I noticed that I missed Commissioner Denkler. Did you have a question, or did I just?
I thought Commissioner's comments was pretty good about how this was going to improve things. And the last time we discussed the mapping for the affordable, the density bonus programs, et cetera, we talked about the correlation with schools. And what I'm seeing in here on your general provisions for citywide affordable housing is you're calculating it by units, not bedrooms. And the reason that's important, and I'm going to give you an example, I looked at all the apartments between Spicewood Springs Road, Mopac, Hard on the west, and Far West on the south. There were 2,700 apartment units, and there was only one complex with a 3-bedroom unit. So if this is an area with transit, it had an exemplary school, it had an exemplary middle school. This was a high opportunity area. And I think we may be doing exactly what, in our goal to reach numbers, we may be missing some of the focus, what we should have here, and making sure we're getting those bedrooms, those extra bedrooms. And when you're calculating this on market rate, okay, we've got, if the market rates, we're going to do proportional in the affordable housing. Well, if they're not building multi-bedrooms, you're not going to get multi-bedrooms. And then I see exceptions that don't necessarily that kind of contradict that. So it's something I think I'd like to see some thought towards. I don't know how to fix the problem. I also, having gone through multiple PUDs, way too many PUDs, you continue defining the bonus density program by the extra square footage, and then you times the fee in lieu of. Well, $6 a square foot for a PUD. You're really not going to make a lot of affordable housing if you do a fee in lieu option. So I'm looking at this, and then I'm seeing, if I'm remembering it right, and I've been reading so much, it's kind of going in and out of my brain a little bit. We allow more impervious cover for smart housing. Well, if this is going in the urban core, that's a flood problem, and I won't trade one for the other because I don't think it ends up helping anybody. So, and then the exceptional block sizes for I know you were looking at height, I know you were looking at the scale, other places, but the blocking seemed excessive. If I'm remembering right, it was 620 feet. So I'm not sure how much we're improving the situation here. I'm really not. So I think you've got to look at some of the we're all talking about putting it in high opportunity areas, and we're not even looking at bedrooms. Mm-hmm.
So just to address the bedroom piece of it a little bit, that's a very real issue and one that we're facing in Portland where I live as well. That our bonus program is calibrated to whatever happens in the existing building, which is largely studios and one bedrooms. And Lisa can correct me if I get the details of it a little bit wrong, but this new version, draft 2 of CodeNEXT, does include an incentive that allows you to have additional square footage to build larger bedrooms or larger units with more bedrooms built into it. There's, of course, a policy trade-off there, and you alluded to it in your own comments, that does create challenges which lead to fewer total units being constructed. So if that's something that everybody is interested in seeing, is looking more deeply at what the impacts of increasing the incentives for multiple bedrooms in the affordable units would look like, that's something we can dig into. It is there to a certain extent already. We just haven't dug into the analysis of it to present you the results.
It came up with enough people at the last meeting because it ties into schools. We are trying to get folks in better schools that are served by transit. This commissioner, I think, spoke to it, Commissioner King. I'm getting comments here. I think you've got to look at it.
Okay.
And we'd be glad to look at the capacity number by changing the number of bedrooms and look at the bedroom mix in the apartments that are being built in the townhouses and increase the number of 2 and 3 bedrooms.
Because using the scenario I gave you, you're just maybe we get 10% in that 2,700, but you'll get 27 units for baristas.
Well,
You're not getting the yeah.
The number of units may go down and the cost per unit may go up, but I think you'll be better off in the long run. You have excess of the unit capacity you need, so I think as long as we make sure it's there, and as Lorelei said, even an incentive, and the capacity with that assumption is still there, you've done all you can with the zoning. Now you have to get it built to the market, which is another thing. But we don't want the zoning to stand in the way. Any zoning should give the market the right signals for family housing.
And that is another example of a place where you could use your density bonus program as a foot in the door for a developer and then say, hey, by the way, we have this tax abatement or this whatever other program to be able to say, if you go with a 2 or 3 bedroom unit instead, you can have this additional incentive. So there's ways that you can layer these together. But for the sake of CodeNEXT, we can dive into that.
Yeah, it's the tying of the proportional units. You're saying the market has, if you're building 100 market units, then at 1 bedroom, then you're going to tie it to the low income at 1 bedroom. That's where I'm having issues. You set it up based on market, proportionality tied to the market. Market's building 1 bedrooms. I was shocked there was 1 3-bedroom out of that complex. Just it was nothing. So
you're lucky if you're getting 1 bedrooms, not just studios.
Well, most of them studios, 1 bedrooms. Yeah, it's all how they defined it. So.
Okay, then I'd like to say something because it is 9:45 and I wish we had so much more time for questions because there's so much to discuss, obviously. And also this forum is really important to us because so far this has been the only forum that where we've had our questions answered and actually been able to work out and resolve some issues. And like the City Council, ZAP and PC have submitted pages of questions, and they have just remained unanswered. But I know that it's clear you're all very busy. We're under a very tight timeline here, And in fact, our recommendation is due on Halloween. And one of the reasons that there was so much to discuss, and I'll just read you our ZAP resolution, which we passed before we had this joint meeting. And that is that the Zoning and Plating Commission finds that the CodeNEXT draft proposes far too many zoning categories. We also find that the zones lack the progression in both sizes and uses that we would expect to see in a well-organized code. We want to see a consistent, user-friendly, simplified code with cumulative zoning. In addition, we ask that our previous recommendations and requests be considered and responded to. And then I just want to look at the bigger picture, and that is looking at the ZAP perspective. We see development and job growth in what you would call the exurbs, or where Commissioner Aguirre pointed out is where you're not looking and considering an area of opportunity. But we have Samsung and Apple campuses in those areas that are outside what's called the urban core. And sprawl is sprawl if we allow it to be sprawl. And if we plan it right, it's a growth center. And so it's a little frustrating to me that we're not planning for these areas still, and that we do have jobs out there. We have people who want to move out there. I just signed a whole bunch of plats this evening, so we know that people are going to be living there. We would just like to have better amenities and better planning and not have to rely on our streets, but actually rely on really good growth centers and good planning. And I have so many other questions. I will just send them to you because we're just running out of time. But I do want to say that saying that you have more affordable units, that you can build them, is just ignoring the fact that the market decides. Just because building will cost less to build does not make it affordable. It will just make it more profitable for the builder unless we can have other tools. And I just had to say that because getting all of this MFIs through whatever, through the goodwill of the developer, I think is not going to happen. And also, when I was expecting the mapping criteria, I was thinking, oh, we'll get something that will be handed to an employee to say this is, and if in the future, if the Texas legislature be willing, we can annex more. This is what's going to happen. So that is just what I'm feeling, and I'm obviously very frustrated. So I will leave it at that. But I will turn to my Vice Chair Duncan.
Closing action.
And unless we'll have 12 more minutes. And sorry, but I'll just pass it to you.
Well, I won't take 12 minutes. Density bonuses. This is a program that I've been looking at for a long time. In fact, about 3 years ago, if I remember right, on CAG, I turned to my colleague Mandy, who's now with the city, and I said, how's the program working? And it brought memories back because she showed me that same chart there, which was in 0.5 font, and I couldn't read it. A few months later, the city auditor confirmed my suspicions that the program was broken. And I'm looking at this as two parts. We've got the going forward, and then we've got what we've got now. My frustration, and you can probably get rid of it totally, but is that I see us putting a lot of energy into going forward and quadrupling the territory that we make this thing work. But we still have a broken system, all right? I'm talking about the existing one. And let me just make this couple of quotes. One is by the RICA president last year. Program is vague and hard to follow. Regulations vary widely. You've heard of OTAC, another Portland consultant. They, in a survey of density bonus programs nationwide, had this to say: no cohesive strategy, too many programs, tremendous inconsistency, immense unpredictability. Just a month ago, the editorial staff of the Statesman said city officials have no idea who's living in the units. They don't know whether they're college students working in coffee shops, seniors on fixed incomes, or low-income working mothers. And then they ended their editorial by saying, given the stakes, the city should slow its march in expanding density bonus programs. I don't understand why we can't get it fixed. I don't understand why we're ignoring a broken. And another thing, and I'm sure I'm wrong on this. I did a study and I counted 8 programs. You just said 12 or 10. I think you're including SMART. I mean, I don't think we even know how many programs we got out there. I did it. I looked at it. I looked at it as MFIs, the duration, the tenure, the percent required, the fees. They're all over the place. They're all over the place. Why can't we amend it? Why can't we get them good? Who is telling you not to touch them? All right? I know that the benefit has really been to enhancing entitlements. It hasn't been enhancing affordability. I mean, it's all we've got left. It's all we've got left. We lost our opportunity for linkage fees and everything else. If we can't do this right, we ought to fold our tents and go home, because we're just talking the talk and we're not walking the walk. And I'm pissed. I'm sorry. I don't. Okay. I apologize for the word piss. Okay, I do have some construction. Why can't we go and why can't, first of all, why don't we introduce in our 8 existing programs non-residential? What's keeping us from doing that? I mean, we're talking about doing it downtown. Why can't we do it everywhere else? Why can't we do non-residential everywhere? We need every cent we can get. Why don't we require a certain percent multi-bedroom? Nobody's doing that. Everybody's doing studios and 1-bedrooms, and you know who's occupying that. It isn't the people who really need it. Okay? What about giving low-income families with children priority on the list? You may be doing that. I hope you are. I mean, there is a list that we could be doing something, and we're not doing it. We're thinking about a glorious program to move throughout the city, which I'm all for. I want that to work. But if we can't get what we've got working, how do we expect to work to do an expanded program? This has nothing to do with the consultants, because it's what you're going to be leaving us. We haven't got a good track record here.
So we would actually love to, well, we have actually addressed many of those concerns ourselves, that we see that there is a lot of inconsistency in our programs.
I could hear. There's a lot of what?
Inconsistency in our programs. I think you were out when I was
yeah, I
that.
apologize. I did miss the first part.
Not a problem. And we'd absolutely love to be able to fix those. There are a number of programs that we would love to eventually be able to bring into the citywide program. Right now, we basically don't have the capacity in terms of consultant time and staff capacity to be able to...
What do you need? I didn't read you that, but I said here, you need to be better funded. You need, and I remember when the auditor came out. Okay, it's been 2 years, and how much progress? I think one of his comments was that you had one person trying to monitor all this. I mean, it's not your fault. I'm not. If you need something from the city council, why don't you tell them, or have us go tell them, because it.
And we have been asking, and actually we'd love to come in from front of this group and talk about our monitoring processes and practices. Actually, Mandy DeMaio would like to do that. She wasn't available this evening, but if you would like to invite us back, we would love to talk about that.
You're welcome
You're
anytime.
invited.
With good news.
Okay, and I'd like to now just entertain questions on the density bonus program, since Vice Chair Duncan spoke so passionately about it. So I see Commissioner White.
So, I guess when I'm looking at the numbers and we're talking about getting about 50,000 units from that could be under 100% MFI, and then we're talking about the density bonus, which is really targeting the 60% and 80% MFI. My question is there, have we considered, and what would it look like to consider targeting those 5,000 units out of that 50,000? Maybe those should be targeted at a lower medium family income. Maybe those should be targeted at the 30 and 60% MFI that we just don't discuss. Because I think that although there's a lot of value in 60% MFI and 80% MFI, we're also in a city where that's extremely high. That's still a really ridiculous amount of money to pay for a family of 4 in rent. And so I'm not sure if the density bonus alone could get us to that 30 to 60% MFI, but I'd be interested in knowing what that does to what we have to give up to get there. What does that look like so that we can have that conversation? And if we can't get there in the density bonus, I know there are other incentives that we've talked about. I think that even though those incentives aren't necessarily part of zoning, we do have an opportunity in this code to set an intention, and perhaps, as you were perhaps alluding to, maybe in the process part of this code, it says, if you go for a density bonus, we ask that you come to a counseling session and talk to you about all the other amazing opportunities that there are. Because there are things that we can put in here that can get us closer to that and make that intention part of the code. And I'll let you answer that before I ask the next one.
Okay, I'll take the first crack at that, and thank you for magically making the slide appear that helps with that. Thank you. So as you've suggested in the way that you even framed your question, that fundamentally it is a trade-off. We can design a bonus program that targets lower than 60% of median family income, but the trade-off is fewer units that are produced. And the slide that we've pulled up here is essentially showing the number of market rate units that are necessary to cross-subsidize the affordability at two different building typologies, a high-rise typology, which has a much higher construction cost, and then a 5 to 7 story sort of podium construction, which is a kind of mid-range construction cost. And at 60% of median family income, which is the current target for rental product in the program, you need 6 units in your high-rise for every 1 unit. And that's assuming a market scenario that's pretty favorable at $3 per square foot of rent. So we can go deeper, but what it means is that in buildings that have fewer units, you won't see anything happen at all, and you will see fewer total units. That's what the outcome will be. So that's a policy question, and one that we're very happy to take direction on, and we could come back and show you how much that 5,000 number decreases if we turn the affordability requirement all the way down to 50% or even 30%, so that you can take that into consideration, but it will be a lower number.
I think we do need to see that, because I think that's a conversation that we need to have amongst ourselves about what that really looks like. And I may be misreading this, but the other piece of the puzzle that we were just talking about, that the type of unit, the number of bedrooms that are within these units, what we have seen from the information from AISD is that when we are getting those 2 and 3 bedroom units, they're not attracting families in these large multifamily developments. And there's, I'm sure, a number of reasons why that is, from outreach to the social impact of living with a bunch of 20-year-olds when you have kids in your house. But I think that we also need to have a conversation about, okay, well, if most of this is coming out of multifamily and most of those density bonus units are expected to be in multifamily, are we actually getting an opportunity for any of these affordable units to be family friendly and oriented? And what does it look like if we target some of these affordable units towards the missing middle, but also the ADUs, these other types of more neighborhood-friendly, single-family products, I guess. What do those options look like, and how does that affect the overall number?
Got it.
And then the other question that I have is, in terms of the density bonus, we've got this 100% MFI with these 50,000 units, and I'm wondering, is there a place within our density bonus to lock those in? I know that those are the numbers that you're seeing could naturally occur in the market, but that could is really big, and that's at 12% profit, as you said. Is there an opportunity for us to pull back a little bit on what you can do in order to get back to that? Because I think a 12% margin of profit is reasonable, but if I could make 20%, what's going to make me do 12%? And so maybe there's a conversation about, well, how do we back up off of the entitlements that we've given in order to get the density bonus to go back to the entitlements that we're seeing. Does that, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Unfortunately, I think you're talking about rent control. And I'm not sure we can do that here.
Well,
I think you're talking about turning down
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
the entitlement.
Yeah.
The base zone lower.
To have some kind of instead of the 60% MFI density bonus, 100% MFI density bonus, so that you make sure you get at least some of those.
Mhm.
And maybe a weaker, more casual program to get a bunch of 100% MFIs that you would get. And it may be that a density bonus is a way to do it. It may be that some other fee forgiveness or something like that may be more effective, but that'd be something to look at.
I think we have to look at
Because
it.
it's not, your return on investment to get a guaranteed 100% MFI is lower. But, you'd have to explain to the public why you're going out of your way to get a $1,700 a month apartment. And
Right.
that's 100% MFI, but a lot of people, that's an expensive new apartment.
Right. I guess that if it's in addition to what we would be getting and not an expense to what we would be getting, that makes sense to me. It becomes the question of, well, we live in a capitalist society. We're supposed to make as much money as we can, and that's the developer's job, is to go out there and make a lot of money. So how do we help balance that out?
The economic answer, and I'm not an economist, but I've been told these things, is that there's more competition because you've got a lot more capacity to build stuff, and that competition will keep rents lower because, you try to charge $2,000 a month for an apartment, someone just down the street is charging $1,600, you're going to find yourself with no business at all. So in part, one of the things that you want to do with the code is you want to get the market stuff working well to where there's no shortages, and they're not competing for the units that you want for your affordable population. That they have plenty of units to be able to fill that need, and there's not a shortage driving prices up. That's kind of what's happened in the Bay Area. And that's why you have the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard, to say just put some units down. I don't care. Get something built here, and they created 400,000 jobs last year and 40,000 units. So you don't want to go there, and I know you're not. But the thought would be is that part of the role of CodeNEXT is to make sure there's enough units to take care of the market stuff. But I don't agree. Certainly in the short term, you're not going to get 12% return because people will be able to make 20 until competition catches up.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm so sorry. It is 10:05, but I will let, because he's been pestering me, Commissioner Anderson make a very brief, I'm timing you.
I work in housing. I love this stuff. Okay, so thank you all for being here. This is promising and good stuff. We keep hearing, and I keep hearing everywhere, just young people pretty much begging for housing, and that just gets really old, and it's like this painful feeling I always have when I have to hear that. And so when I hear of a potential scenario where we can get another map that has a lot more affordable housing, I'm saying 1,000 times yes, assuming that it's feasible. Eco Northwest, verifies it, and you guys give your thumbs up to it. Commissioner Vela has been asking for a much stronger map, not to say let's pass a stronger map, but to say what does that look like? How can we look at that and how can we understand it better? We do hear from a small subset of folks who want to protect single-family homes at all costs from seeing change in any regard. My hope is that we can maybe look at other things as being maybe more so valuable, such as affordability, transit, environment, fiscal health, our human health, and that we can get more missing middle and transitional zones on the ground. I feel like for 2 years we learned about these things, 5 years rather, and we don't have it. The map is almost bereft of these things, and so whatever we can do to get that great map with really strong affordability would be wonderful. Thanks.
Betsy did. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
If we have comments to them, how can we? Because I have some comments I'd like to get directly to them.
And I even have more. I completely agree. Why don't we just submit them to your respective, or just submit? We have their emails now. I would say just submit them to the respective. Do you want to do that, or do
I don't know. I think it should
staff.
Send it to the chairs or to our staff liaison.
You mean to?
I actually want to get the comments to them to influence the map or whatever they're working on. It's just we didn't have enough time tonight to finish. And time is of the essence, so I
That's what
want
I
to get
thought.
as
So
much.
do you want to just deal directly with the appropriate consultant or staff member, or?
If it's appropriate, but I don't know if that's what we should do.
If Planning Commission could copy me if they're sending something to
Right.
staff for those questions, that'd be great.
Okay.
We prefer that you go through the chair and then through the staff, and we'll work with the
Yeah, I
consultants.
was going to, exactly, because, I mean, I'm not going to, there's just not enough time for us to compile them, and also, you know, we all know now who's responsible for what.
Okay.
And future
So-
joint meetings, October 24th, November 7th.
Okay.
Jerry,